Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully, you've already gotten a few snacks. So we are glad to be able to provide that for you. We are live streaming. It is our first opportunity to try this since we're back in person. So I also wanted to make sure people knew for consent purposes that we are live streaming so that our coalitions and advocates and partners across the country are able to watch this amazing panel we were able to pull together. So for those of you who are in the back, there's a camera in the back, and then there's one right in the front. Thank you. So thank you all for coming today. It is with a great level of appreciation that you all were able to make it and get through the security lines. I would be remiss if I did not start out by thanking the amazing people who made this happen. We are all on brand today, so you can see us in teal. Ellen Fern out front does not have on teal, but she has on a teal pin. So many of you know her as our government relations partner, so she is out front and made this possible, along with the staff and offices who I will thank later. But I certainly have to thank my colleagues, LaQuisha up front, who has joined us as our housing project coordinator, Maureen Gallagher, who's our policy coordinator, who's also in the back recording, and then all of you know because you received an email or have watched her amazing work, and that is none other than the incomparable Terry Moore, who is truly, she is my work bestie, she is the boss of me, she is my mama bear, but more importantly, she is our policy director and has truly made a huge imprint in the anti-sexual violence movement, and so I couldn't start without thanking her. And also, I wouldn't be up here with these notes if it wasn't for Terry Moore. So thank you for that too. So thank you again. My name is Monika Hostler, and I get the great privilege to be the president and CEO of the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. We are the voice for 56 state and territorial coalitions who represent over 1,300 rape crisis centers throughout the United States and our U.S. territories. I can't tell you what an honor it is to serve alongside and be the voice in Washington, D.C. for my colleagues who do the work in the trenches every day to ensure survivors are served and communities understand the pathway forward to preventing sexual violence. It is vital that we hear about the real lived experiences of survivors, our advocates, and we're grateful to have those survivor voices in the room today. Many of you know from her amazing best-selling book, Love with Accountability, we have survivor activist Aishah Shahidah Simmons with us today, who will speak along with our other speakers about both her professional and personal experiences. Thank you for joining us today. I would also like to thank our congressional co-hosts, Senators Casey and Murkowski, as well as Senator Capito and her staff for making sure that we secured this room, the mics, and the snacks in the back to make this day happen today. So thank you, Haley, for making that happen. All three of these senators have been major champions for sexual assault survivors, and many of you as advocates have worked with their offices likewise. Every year, the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence does a survey to our local programs so that we can really cover what they're finding is gaps in services, gaps in funding, and what our survivors really need. And what we know to be true is that less than half of our programs have what they need, and that's a full-time therapist to provide free or low-cost therapy to all survivors who come forward to our doors. We also know that the need is not just tremendous, but at the same time, 70% of those programs experienced an increase in demand for services this year. And programs are responding to the needs in very large service areas with very small staff, who are also, for those in the room who work in this field know, are often underpaid. The salary noted that most of our program staff at the local level, their salaries are less than $30,000 a year for a full-time advocate. I should note full-time as a direct service provider is 40 hours plus on call. And I don't have to talk to you about where we are with the cost of living today in this country. Even our most rural programs, $30,000 does not meet the need for the level of work that they are seeing. We're also hearing from our local programs, which you will get to hear today, that the impact, the way that services have happened since COVID has escalated in lethality, and more important, the needs are more dire than ever. And you'll be able to hear today from our own survivor advocate today, who from a local program, Ms. LaQuisha Anthony, is here to share that local program perspective with us in more detail today. These programs provide services to survivors, whether they're sexually assaulted by a family member as a child, sexually assaulted or harassed in a workplace, on college campus, the military, or an attack by the build the ever-growing evidence base to prevent sexual violence. Prevention is possible, but it is also essential. The National Alliance to End Sexual Violence has worked very closely with the CDC, and we are honored that Dr. Sarah Degue can also be with us today to share some of the important research the Rape Prevention Education Program has critically done with the funding through RPE at the CDC Injury Center. So thank you for joining us as well, Dr. Degue. In terms of direct services for survivors, the VOCA Crime Victims Fund is a non-taxpayer source that's distributed by the Office of Victims of Crime, and it has been a critical lifeline for victim services. Many of us know that those deposits have decreased, and they are historically at low levels, and we ask that Congress work to find pathways to ensure that that funding becomes stable again and remains stable. In addition, we are grateful for the investments of the Sexual Services Program at the Office on Violence Against Women, and we are excited to be working alongside of them as we work on our new housing collaborative to address sexual violence more comprehensively as both a cause and a result of housing instability. Together with all of these programs, including the ARPA Sexual Assault Funds, VOCA, SAS, and RPE, they are all foundational to our response to survivors and also a pathway for prevention. But we have more work to do, and you're in this room because you're a part of that work that we will continue to do together. You will hear about the work that our leaders across the country, across the government, have done to problem solve on how we address and end sexual violence. You'll hear directly from survivors and programs. And we hope that what you will gain from today, new partners, new colleagues, and a road forward with us as we continue to move forward to ending sexual violence in this country. Thank you all very much, and I will now turn it over to the Assistant Secretary Contreras.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Very glad to be here with you. I have the privilege of serving as the Assistant Secretary for the Administration for Children and Families of January Contreras. Previous to this, for the last 8 years, I ran a legal aid organization where I did serve survivors of many different crimes, including sexual assault. And I want to share my thanks for your leadership, for inviting me to be here today, and recognize the leadership of Shondell Dawson as well, because her leadership is tremendous, not only in ACF, not only in HHS, but across this U.S. government and the country. And so very glad to be working in partnership with her. What I want to do a little bit is just share where we are. I mean, we know that domestic violence and sexual assault, we have that. We also have trafficking work that we do at ACF. We know that all these things are, there's intersection between them. That these crimes, that these experiences, these challenges, they impact survivors' lives and the lives of their children in so many ways. And so we know that it's important for us at ACF to be looking at this through a comprehensive public health lens. We want to make sure that we're looking at how does the funding that we have in terms of how it's being allocated, the policies and the practices that we're able to influence, how are they impacting the survivors in their daily lives, their physical and behavioral health, their safety, their housing, their economic mobility and stability, and their well-being, as well as that of their children and adolescents. As we talk about the work of ACF, I hope some of you know, but I want to share that we did recently have an exciting change. In the beginning of April of this year, this month that we're in, ACF established a new Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services. So this moved the division, what was previously a division, thank you, what was previously a division down in FISB, the Family Youth and Services Bureau, up to the leadership table of ACF. And my understanding is that this is another recommendation that came from the advocate community yourselves, saying, we need to have leadership at that higher level. So we're very proud to have made that happen. I think it goes as just another demonstration of President Biden, the Biden-Harris administration, and Secretary Becerra's commitment to making sure that we are looking to support survivors and looking at prevention in a very holistic way. So of course I'm excited to again just give recognition to Director Shondell Dawson. She was the formerly director of a program in a division. She is now the director of the office, and we're so proud to. We had her at our first leadership event in that leadership role just earlier this week, and it's just great to have her at the table in that way. I do want to talk briefly about the American Rescue Plan, how it made a difference for sexual assault survivors across our nation. That one sentence that I know many people worked very hard to make happen, it's just amazing to see that at work. The purpose of the ARP grants to support survivors of sexual assault or to assist with the transition to virtual and remote services for rape crisis centers, such an important need. Sexual assault programs, tribal programs, and culturally specific programs that provide crisis services, support services, and assistance to survivors of sexual assault. States, territories, and tribes are receiving additional supplemental funding. Recipients of the ARP grants to support survivors of sexual assault were able also to award sub-awards, which is such an important way to make sure that we're showing this money that came from one sentence to the federal government, went through a network of providers, and then down to the local level where providers on the ground are supporting people in their own communities with ways that they know how to fund them and serve them in the best way. In addition, with that funding, ACF launched funding for culturally specific sexual assault capacity building centers. So those enhance intervention and prevention efforts for victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, and family violence for members of racial and ethnic minority groups that can often be left marginalized. It's included African Americans, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Latinos, Latinas, and the three programs that were funded are Mujeres Latinas en Acción, a bilingual bicultural agency that empowers Latinas by providing services which reflect their values and culture. Monsoon Asians and Pacific Islanders in Solidarity, an organization that serves victims and survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking in Asian and Pacific Islander communities. And the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, an assistance provider that uses culturally based training, technical assistance, and a wide range of activities to engage and support survivors of sexual violence, advocacy, service providers, and community and allies that are working to end sexual violence and sex trafficking within tribal communities. These investments matter for all communities. These investments matter for our country. And we appreciate that support and that advocacy that happened to create these new supports for survivors of sexual assault. And maybe they're not new supports. Maybe the work was already happening just without the investment. And so making that happen. We're so glad to welcome sexual assault providers to ACF as grantees. And we hope that you consider yourself at home at ACF. To continue to strengthen the use of the American Rescue Plan and to uplift Sexual Assault Awareness Month, just to share a little bit about ACF's mission, we are out to raise awareness about the reach and the impact of the Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services. Don't forget to remember the new acronym because it's no longer HIPSA, the Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services. We want to do that nationally, we want to do that in local communities, and to promote the success stories of how the grant monies are being used, so we can tell that story of this is how it's making a difference in every community. We want to raise awareness about the prevalence of sexual violence and the existing network of services to support individuals and families struggling with domestic violence and sexual violence. We want to promote primary prevention efforts to ensure that individuals, families, and communities have a future without sexual assault. To provide support to advocates in the field doing this very important work. And to share the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act data. Share data to illuminate the need for sexual assault services. for survivors, and to help others understand the long-term consequences of sexual violence. So again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today, for the opportunity to share the Administration for Children and Families and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services commitment with you to sexual assault prevention and response. And as we honor those who have dedicated their careers to prevention and response, and especially to the survivors, I just restate that ACF and HHS are here to be your ally. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Lynn Rosenthal. I'm the Director of Sexual and Gender-Based Violence at HHS, and I, for one, do not take for granted having Assistant Secretary Contreras at HHS. In fact, her appointment, I've said this to you, was the one that made me jump up and down when I heard about it. So we're so grateful to you. I'm here, yes. I think I'm here mainly as a cheerleader for our subject matter experts and advocates and survivors who are to come. I do want to say that I'm also here to sound the alarm a little bit. You'll hear more from my colleague Sarah Degue about the data of the prevalence and the effects of sexual violence. However, when we know that 27% of women have experienced a rape or attempted rape in their lifetimes, and far more women and men experience some form of unwanted sexual contact, then we have a significant problem. It's a significant problem that is also significantly unaddressed and under-resourced in this country. It is especially under-resourced in the health and mental health sectors. We know that sexual violence survivors have higher rates of suicidal ideation and behaviors, and that sexual violence is a unique form of trauma that has severe effects physically, emotionally, and spiritually. A unique form of trauma. There's consensus today, as everyone in this room likely knows, among advocates and survivor groups that the public health approach is how we should be leading to prevent sexual violence and mitigate its effects on those who have experienced it. Yet here at HHS, you'll hear today, we only have 2 dedicated funding streams to address sexual violence. The important new funding at the Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services under the Rescue Act, and then the rape prevention and education funding that you'll hear about from Sarah. These funds are being put to great use and taking critical, important steps, but it's nowhere near enough to scale up our efforts. And you'll hear from Sarah, we know today some of what works to prevent sexual violence. We can do this, but we have to do it with an investment. When we think about the alarming recent headlines from the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, that very high rates of girls and sexual minority youth are experiencing sexual violence, we know that much more is needed. I just came from working in Columbus, Ohio, where I was part of a domestic violence and child advocacy center, and we started to see a trend during the pandemic, specifically of teenagers, adolescents coming in with injuries, severe injuries from sexual violence. And we started to see this sort of, it's always been there, but we suddenly started to see this as a trend during the pandemic. Across HHS, we're taking a close look at all this data, and we're identifying the nexus with our work across the department. Just this week, I attended SAMHSA's Women's Advisory Committee, where they led a robust discussion about the health and mental health effects of sexual violence and substance abuse. Also this week, the incredible culturally specific resource centers that Assistant Secretary Contreras talked about, and Convincia Grade is here, came in to meet with Admiral Levine in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Health, and also with the Office of Minority Health and the Office of Women's Health. So we're committed to ensuring that we're taking this intersectional approach to address survivor health and well-being across the department. Last week, I attended the Cherokee Nation's Families Are Sacred conference, and I urge you to look at what the Cherokee Nation is doing because it's a model. It's a model. And Principal Chief Hoskin, who's a great leader of the nation, said, what we're doing is wrapping a blanket of safety and support around survivors. That's the model approach to sexual violence. It's my belief, and it's supported by the data, that if we would address sexual violence and its effects on those who have experienced it, we could significantly improve well-being for individuals, families, and communities. So that's our charge to all of us. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Aishah.
Good afternoon. My name is Shahidah Simmons, and I am a survivor and documentary filmmaker and writer. I'm also a mindfulness practitioner and teacher who really believes in the power of compassionate presence, and just want to invite everyone to just take some intentional breaths as we talk about these very important topics. And my experience is that the breath is a grounding anchor. And that can support us. And sometimes breathing is difficult, so just feeling the sensations of either standing on the floor or sitting on the chair and feeling the sacred earth beneath you. So, like too many children in the United States and across the globe, my introduction to sexuality did not include consent. My divorced parents traveled extensively for their international human rights work. And when my parents were on the road, I stayed with family or friends. And while I was raised in a metaphorical village, my paternal grandparents most often cared for me. And it was there from the ages of 10 until 12 that my step grandfather, the only paternal grandfather I knew, sexually abused me. I told my divorced parents when the abuse occurred. They never confronted my grandfather or removed me from the site of repeated terror. My parents' actions or lack thereof taught me to endure sexual abuse and lovingly engage with Pop Pop, the first man who took the night away from me. Despite the horror that I survived, I'm unequivocal in my belief that what transpired is not the sum total of Pop Pop, who committed the acts, nor my parents, who through their inaction allowed it to happen. I do not share this to condone any transgressions, but to underscore the contradictions and complexities that many survivors of childhood sexual abuse hold, all of which call for compassionate, survivor-centered responses to harm. Based on the global statistics of sexual violence committed against all humans, I don't want to imply that I would not have been raped as a young adult woman, yet I know my childhood sexual abuse was a primer for my rape by a brand new acquaintance on a date during a study abroad program in my sophomore year in college. Like many who are sexually assaulted, I thought I had the right to change my mind, to say no, and that my wishes would be honored. Tragically, that wasn't the case in 1989, and it's still often not the case in 2023. Too many lack empathy, compassion, and an understanding of what victim survivors endure when sexually abused. Rape and other forms of sexual violence are often just words attached to stigma and shame, resulting in a lot of silence on the part of victim survivors. We often don't view it as traumatic acts, as body invasions often committed by trusted acquaintances, family members, or other loved ones. Sexual violence is not only a form of physical violence, but it is often psychological, emotional, and mental violence that leaves an indelible imprint from which some victim survivors never recover. Were it not for 30 years of therapy and 20 years of a dedicated mindfulness meditation practice, I don't know if I could speak before all of you today. For 3 decades, I used my survivor-centered creative voice to break unspeakable silences, focus on healing paths from trauma, and cultivate humane responses to the inhumane acts of sexual violence. 12 years in the making, my 2006 release, groundbreaking film, No, the Rape documentary, was internationally acclaimed as it centered Black survivor testimonies through breaking taboos that hid rape and sexual assault in African American communities. The film brought together leading African American scholars, theologians, artists, activists, men, women, and survivors to break silences and commit ourselves to reshaping patriarchal cultures of violence against women and LGBTQ communities. My 2020 Lambda Literary Award winning anthology, Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse, grew from my healing work. I shared briefly about the benefits of therapy and a mindfulness practice in my life. Well, the words love with accountability emerged during a meditation session at home when my parents were unwilling or unable to face the harsh reality of their bystanding roles in my childhood sexual abuse. I began signing love with accountability in virtually every communique with them. In doing so, I emphasized that my deep love and profound respect for my parents could not shield their lack of accountability for the sexual violence I endured as a child and the subsequent 30-year denial. There are approximately 40 to 42 million child sexual abuse survivors in the United States, which means there are millions of bystanders involved in either looking the other way, allowing the abuse to happen, or covering up the abuse that occurred. I invited 40 diasporic Black sexual abuse survivors and advocates, including Monika, to join me in envisioning what love with accountability could look like in response to childhood sexual abuse. The anthology explores how the silence around child sexual abuse in the familial institution directly creates a culture of sexual violence in all other institutions, including but not limited to religious, academic, activist, entertainment, political, and professional. I don't believe we should talk about adult rape, including campus rape, without discussing childhood sexual abuse. For too many victim survivors of rape, of which I'm one, childhood sexual abuse is a precursor. I believe ending sexual violence starts with ending childhood sexual abuse, and ending childhood sexual abuse begins in the family. The collection of writings also addresses the profound harm that comes when the only option for addressing childhood sexual abuse is incarceration. There are several who believe that we must make use of what few resources exist while we co-create something different for the future. I believe we must move beyond just only relying on the criminal justice system as the only and viable option for survivors to receive accountability and heal. My wish is for all survivors one day that there will be an unwavering belief that any sexual violence committed against us was not our fault. Imagine if all of us thought that sexual violence committed against all humans was unthinkable. What could happen? What would it mean if every educator, religious leader, judge, attorney, elected official, medical doctor, high profile entertainer, and athlete believed that and used their spheres of influence to make it clear that any form of sexual violence committed against children and adults is unacceptable? These are some of the reality definers because they have the power to shape norms in our lives. We need culturally competent, trauma informed, therapeutic, somatic, and other survivor centered healing resources accessible to all survivors, regardless of race, gender identity, physical, sight, and hearing ability, religion, and socioeconomic status. I've been living with the effects of PTSD from sexual trauma for over 40 years and have been on an intentional healing journey for 31 years. I'm interested in and committed to understanding what causes sexual violence and how can we disrupt and ultimately end it humanely. I don't want someone else's inhumanity to result in my reacting or behaving inhumanely. We also have to move beyond solely focusing on the harm doer and work to understand the conditions and silent bystander mentality that allows for childhood and adult sexual violence to occur. I want every victim survivor to take the avenues that best support their full recovery and total healing. Without question, I believe people who commit violence and who are bystanders to violence must be held accountable. Simultaneously, I'm committed to communal responses to sexual violence that utilize restorative justice and transformative justice practices. My goal as a public survivor, a filmmaker, a writer, a Buddhist, and mindfulness meditation teacher is to work in tandem with others to co-create survivor-centered, brave spaces that offer multiple roadmaps that explore how we can heal from, disrupt, end, and ultimately prevent sexual violence without only relying on the crime and punishment models that we currently have. There aren't easy overnight solutions. There isn't a one-size-fits-all model. Childhood and adult sexual violence by their nature are complex. We must work to create compassionate, survivor-centered accountability systems that honors these complexities. We must, in the words of the late Black lesbian feminist poet who was the poet laureate of New York in 1991 to 1992, Audre Lorde, quote, be deliberate and intentional, end quote, in our responses and approaches to ending this pandemic. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here today to represent CDC on this amazing panel to talk about the long-term effects of sexual violence. Aishah's story reminds us of why we do this work. Sexual violence has enormous impacts on survivors that last a lifetime. And it's on all of us to not only support survivors in their healing, but to prevent others from experiencing that violence in the first place. In CDC's Division of Violence Prevention, where I work, that's exactly what we do. We focus on preventing violence before it begins. Through research, practice, and partnerships, we work to identify violence prevention strategies that are effective and bring them to communities. And you may know that we've made a lot of progress in the last few decades in that area, but sexual violence remains a serious public health problem. The most recent data from CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey finds that half of women and 1 in 3 men will experience some form of contact sexual violence in their lifetime. And this violence often starts early, as Aishah's story also reinforces, right? Most survivors experience rape for the first time before age 25, and more than half before age 18. Just today, about an hour and a half ago, actually, we released new data from the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey on sexual violence among youth. And we found that 1 in 9 high school students experienced some form of sexual violence in the past year. And the highest rates were found among girls, sexual minority youth, and students in some racial and ethnic minority groups. For example, nearly 1 in 5 American Indian, Alaskan Native high school students experienced forced sexual intercourse in the past year alone. Similar disparities by gender, sexual minority status, race and ethnicity have been found among adults as well. So we know that the burden of sexual violence is not borne equally across our society. And these experiences have both immediate and long-term effects. In the short term, sexual violence can, of course, cause physical injury, acute psychological trauma, exposure to infectious diseases, and pregnancy. In fact, CDC data suggests that about 3 million women in the United States have experienced a rape-related pregnancy. But the long-term effects of sexual violence are even broader. They include physical and mental health conditions, maternal health outcomes, and behavioral health risks, like depression and anxiety disorders, suicide attempts, pregnancy complications, substance use disorder, cancer, and chronic pain. And beyond health, sexual violence also affects survivors' lives in other ways, including impacts on educational and financial outcomes and future relationships. Evidence suggests that survivors tend to complete fewer years of education, miss more days of work and school, and have lower incomes on average. And they're also more likely to experience intimate partner violence in adolescence and adulthood, and to experience sexual violence again, really underscoring the importance of preventing this violence before it begins. Overall, there's consistent evidence that sexual violence not only has immediate and direct consequences, but also has a lasting effect on the lives of survivors. And those consequences are costly. In fact, we did a study at CDC a few years ago where we estimated the total cost of rape to the US economy over the lifetime of all victims in the US population. We looked not only at costs paid by survivors themselves, but at costs paid by the government or society at large. So that includes things like medical costs, lost productivity, and criminal justice costs. And we found that the total lifetime cost of rape was about $122,000 per victim. And when you multiply that by the number of victims in the population, which is more than 25 million, the total economic burden of rape is $3.1 trillion. $3.1 trillion. So understanding these economic costs, in addition to the direct costs and the personal costs to survivors, really helps us understand the critical importance of prevention and finding those effective strategies that we can implement to reduce these impacts on individuals and on our communities. So I want to end by emphasizing that not only is prevention critical, but it's also possible, as Lynn alluded to, right? We are learning more every day about what works. In addition to ongoing research at CDC to add to that knowledge and the work of the Rape Prevention and Education program, we've developed a number of tools and resources to help communities identify and implement effective prevention. One of these that you may have seen is the Stop SV Technical Package, which is a resource for action that identifies 5 key strategies for sexual violence prevention based on the best available evidence. Things like promoting social norms that protect against violence and creating protective environments. And this resource can help communities focus their efforts and their resources on what works. There are some cards available outside with information on how to access this tool, as well as a lot of other resources that CDC provides on violence prevention. Sexual violence is not inevitable. It is a significant and costly public health problem, and it can be prevented. At CDC, we are dedicated to tracking the size of the problem, expanding the evidence base for prevention, focusing on strategies that work, and supporting widespread implementation in communities. I know that together we can end sexual violence. And I would like to thank all of you here today for your dedication and your commitment to that work, and to all of our partners and practitioners in the field who are doing that work. And with that, I will turn it over to LaQuisha to talk about that work. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am LaQuisha Anthony, and I am a survivor and an advocate. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with you all in reference to this important issue. Sexual violence is a serious public health problem that profoundly impacts lifelong health, opportunity, and the well-being of everyone. People of all genders, regardless of their sexual orientation, their age, are impacted by this traumatic experience of sexual violence. The statistics show that 1 in 4 women in the US will experience completed or attempted rape in their lifetimes. Of those who experience rape, 1 in 3 are between the ages of 11 and 17. 1 in 4 men in the US experience some form of sexual contact in their lifetime that is not consensual, including 1 in 20 who will experience rape. Of those men who experience rape, 1 in 4 are between the ages of 11 and 17. Many studies show that because of stigma, fear, shame, most sexual violence goes unreported. Indeed, in recent years, between 20 and 40% of rapes and sexual assaults are not reported. Like an iceberg, much of the real extent of sexual violence in our society is still under the surface. I'm here today as a survivor of sexual violence and an advocate because talking about this critical problem, which is extremely prevalent in our society, is what opens the door to positive change. Every day in my work at WOAR, Philadelphia Center Against Sexual Violence, I encounter survivors of sexual assault and sexual harassment and abuse who are courageous and heroic, and individuals from all walks of life who share their agonizing stories, use their voices to help others fight to end sexual violence. While sexual violence happens in every community, we know that communities who are impacted the most are racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQ, transgender persons, and other marginalized groups. We are coming to the close of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and this year's theme draws a focus on the roles and forms of oppression and perpetuating violence. There is a direct link between sexual violence and racism, poverty, homophobia, and other forms of oppression. More often than not, being a survivor of sexual violence is accompanied by a lifelong healing process that is different for each individual. While some providers like WAR are fortunate to offer an array of programming, including counseling, trauma-informed therapy, and more, many across the Commonwealth and across this nation are limited to crisis intervention and prevention education solely. Through the allocation of funds through PCAR, Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, WAR and other centers across PA are able to sustain these critical programs, but limited in our ability to expand and offer innovative and evidence-based programming. WAR is grateful to receive the largest allocation in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that allows us to offer programs like our Safeguards program, our Survivor Advocate program, our Safe Touch program, where we're teaching kids about who should touch you, where, why, and how. But in a city of 1.5 million people, we also know that with more funding, we could do so much more to meet the demand of crisis services, healing opportunities, and to permeate all communities with effective education, training, and advocacy work. Put simply, the extent of services offered is simply not enough to support the needs of survivors to make a dent in preventing sexual violence. We already heard that the cost of sexual violence is $122,000 across a lifetime. But you can't put a true dollar amount on the emotional, physical, psychological cost of sexual violence. Sexual violence takes a toll on individuals' mind, body, spirit, and wallets. And the process of healing takes different course for each survivor. In my daily work with the post-therapy survivor advocate program, I see how everyday life experiences, such as being a parent, watching the news, going to the doctor for physicals or routine examinations, and more can trigger more suffering and more trauma for that individual. I myself, for example, I experienced something that appeared to be a possible miscarriage while carrying my son. Going to the doctor to be examined that day during a time when the world was only allowing one person in the room, in the exam room. I knew that I needed a support person with me. And as I discovered the fate of my unborn child, my 20-year history of sexual violence included a previous pregnancy that was a result of rape. Because I experienced programming like that of WAR, I knew how to advocate for myself in that moment. I knew that I could have a support person in the room with me. I knew how to use my voice and protect myself. I knew that lifestyle of healing is something that we continue to do, because as a survivor, it does not happen overnight where you feel that you arrived at this place of healing. Everyday circumstances remind us of that day, of that moment, of that experience. In our society, we have the just move on culture with many experiences, even like grief and trauma. And we often just want to move on. But as humans, we don't just move on from traumatic experiences like sexual violence. These experiences fundamentally change who we are and how we navigate the world around us. The victimization isn't limited to the experience of sexual violence. People who experience sexual violence are more likely to consider suicide and much more likely to be addicted to substance abuse, much more likely to suffer from depression and mental health challenges, and much more likely to suffer in isolation or alone. Organizations like WAR are beacons of light in darkness. The brighter we are, the more light we shine. We can all reach the corners of all communities. People like me don't often get the opportunity to sit before bodies like this, to have the authority or influence to help transform our systems or to push to end sexual violence. We need to make sure that funding gets to local communities, urban, suburban, and rural. We need to be able to fund innovative new projects like our Survivor Advocate program through competitive grants, but that shouldn't come at the expense of properly funding baseline resources everywhere. We need to make sure that funding gets to local communities. It needs to get on the ground where we are working with people daily. WAR was founded 50 years ago and to become one of the first crisis center in the country. Back then, there was no system of support like we have today. There was no PCAR. We can be grateful for how far we have come, and still acknowledge that we're barely moving the needle in our vision to end sexual violence, and we must do more. The pandemic reminded us that every positive step forward, we can stumble backwards. Sexual violence thrives in the dark, hidden corners of our society, and we need to amplify our efforts and sustain them in a constant barrage of support and messaging. To do this, organizations like WOAR need expanded funding. And to achieve this, organizations like PCAR need your support to expand allocations. It has been an honor to speak with you all today, and I encourage you to be bold in your help in strengthening the safety net of support that weaves its way into the Commonwealth and across this nation to help survivors heal and fight the end of sexual violence. Thank you, and you will now hear from Monika.
I hope you all were both moved and reminded, but also invigorated on how we move forward by every one of our speakers. If you'll join me in thanking them by a round of applause for joining us. It is also a visual reminder for me, as a Black woman who began this work 27 years ago, when there weren't many faces that looked like mine, to see the ways in which we've truly transformed our movement and our field and the way that we do our work by both being leaders, speakers, and those who are making the difference here on the Hill on behalf of the voices that you hear from all of us across the country. I hope you also heard, and I know that you did, but it bears repeating, that we are more than grateful for the ways in which the government has invested in ending sexual violence and also responding to those who are harmed. But it is also important that that investment be increased. And you heard loud and clear from our Assistant Secretary and Lynn Rosenthal from HHS and the Center for Disease Control in the ways in which those investments are changing lives. But you also heard from both Aishah and LaQuisha on the ways in which more investments can continue to change lives, but also open up new ways that we do our work. As I listen to the speakers, I'm reminded that 26 years ago when I began this work, we were a crisis line. That's what we did. We went into communities at their request. 26 years later, we are asking that those investments continue to look at innovative ways to provide services, but also allow survivors to define what the innovation looks like. So oftentimes when we're asking for increased funding, we're asking for stability in the Victims of Crime Act, that it still is a response to answering the phone or providing prevention services. But more importantly, it's about hearing the voices of survivors saying, I want you to invest in my somatic system. I want you to pay for meditation as a way that I'm going through my healing journey. Because as you heard from LaQuisha, there is not an end. We don't have a timetable. It is a journey. And having worked on those crisis line, sometimes that phone call is from a person who their experience was 30 years ago and something happened that day and the crisis line was their lifeline. And oftentimes our services aren't set up or funded to respond to the person who's coming to us 30 years later and need a lifeline. And that is us. That is those of us who provide this work. So we are asking Congress to ensure that the Crime Victims Fund receives steady funding, whether it's through increased penalties or through other means, to ensure that the funding remains at $2 billion. At the Office on Violence Against Women, we're asking for $1 billion for sexual assault support services, and we're asking for $100 million for the rape prevention and education program at the CDC. While these numbers sound very large, and we understand to our staffers here who will report back to their members, you've also heard the amount of money that it costs, not just the individual, not their families, not their community, but our economy. And so whatever language you need to convey that, whether you're speaking to the person as an individual, or you're speaking to the ways in which it hits us square in our pockets as members of our country, I think you've heard from all of our folks on this panel ways in which you can convey that message. And I also think I stand ready and able to say that any of them would be happy to continue to share comments, feedback, or resources, as Sarah mentioned, that are available on the table. So whatever ways that we can help you ensure that the investment continues to grow and meet the needs of survivors of sexual violence, consider us your partners, and we consider you a part of the field as you continue to convey our need for investments in ending sexual violence. Thank you all for your time and for sharing with us. And please feel free to have more drinks and little snacks back there. But again, and thank you to my videographers and reporters. Hopefully people were able to experience this live. Thank you all very much for being here.